Hi, friends. I want to do a video about getting your feet wet with Adobe Illustrator. So I'm just going to give you a few ideas and then a few demos. And there's also links in the YouTube description for relevant LinkedIn learning. Obviously, you can go a lot deeper with LinkedIn learning or just playing around. But here's my guide to playing around, just sort of knowing what you're doing. So let's just start with a little bit of light vocabulary. So there's an idea here that's important, and it's really the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator, the difference between pixels and vectors. So you see on the left there a pixel image, and it's made up of pixels that are darkened or lightened. So even the curves, to be a little less chunky, they've shaded those edges. That's what's called anti-aliasing technique. So you don't see the stair step. You kind of make those little shades. And if you squint a little bit, it kind of looks like a sharp line. And then you see a clean edge, right? Something made in vectors that can scale up without breaking down. So another way to look at it is like this. Okay, are we describing the image as a collection of pixels, or are we actually describing it as something mathematical, right? The sense in which a circle is just simply all of the points that are equidistant from one point. So no matter how big you make that circle, it's still a circle, right? And so if you describe your images in vectors, they scale up neatly and you can adjust them without them starting to blur out or show their pixels. And Photoshop is Adobe's big pixel editing program, and Adobe Illustrator is their big vector editing program. And they line up in certain ways, and often we do projects that involve both vector-based design and pixel-based things like photographs, so they do speak to each other. And Photoshop can handle some paths, and Illustrator can handle some bitmaps, that is raster images. So anyway, let's do that vocabulary instead of just using it. So when you're talking pixels, we talk about a pixel image as being a bitmap, or a raster. Okay, that describes just something that is made in pixels. And then creating that illusion of curves is called the anti-aliasing technique, the shaded pixels. And all of these file types are pixel-based file types: JPEG, GIF, PNG, TIFF, and PSD. On the vector side, these are scalable graphics. So anytime you talk about scalable graphics, anytime you're talking about a path or a pen tool, that is usually dealing with vectors. Now, we also have the pen tool to like volume in Premiere Pro, but for our purposes, and it's similar actually, the keyframes and that sort of stuff, it's a similar way of thinking, but paths and pens are all associated with vectors, not pixels, as well as Bezier curves. That's if I go back a few, that when you see the handles like that, that describes a Bezier curve, and it's a way of describing a curve or a corner and being able to manipulate it, those handles. And file types such as EPS, encapsulated PostScript, SVG, scalable vector graphics, and then the Illustrator format is a .ai. Okay, enough vocabulary. Let's dive in. And this part, if you want to sort of see what it's all about and come back to it during class to follow along, that's good. If you have Illustrator on your laptop and you just want to do it, that's also good. You could go further along in class and experiment. But let me show you. I'm just starting, just opened up Illustrator, and all I've done is created a new document. That's all I've done. There's nothing here. I selected the size. That's it. So you can meet me here in class, and you could just sort of take an overview and then bring this back up during class if you want to follow along. This will be basically our first class exercise. The way I like to get students into Illustrator is just starting by making some shapes. So you see here we have a rectangle tool, and anytime you see that little corner, you actually have more shapes under there. But go ahead and start with the rectangle tool and drag out a few rectangles, just a few shapes to start getting us going. And you see that if you hold Option, it'll sort of lock to certain sizes. Make a few rectangles, they can overlap or not. And I like to make a few circles or ellipses. Do a few of these. And if you're really feeling fancy, maybe a star or two. Okay, so we got a few things to play with here. Now, the real heart of this lesson is right up here, these two, the black arrow and the white arrow. So the black arrow is the selection tool. very familiar from our Adobe tools. We almost always have just a regular selection tool that lets you grab things and move them, right? I'm grabbing the whole shape, and I can even grab the corner and scale it, transform it a little bit, drift outside that, I can rotate it. But basically, I'm moving around objects with my selection tool. No great shakes. But the white tool, the direct selection tool, is interesting and different because what you see here is I go over the shape itself and it lets me select just a path, just one line, and start to manipulate. Or it lets me select an anchor and I can start to change the dynamics of this shape. Okay, and this works also on the circular ones, right? Can change the path there. You start to see those Bezier curves can really change the dynamics of the shape, start to really play with it and manipulate it. Same goes for our friend, the star. Let me round those corners too, which is pretty cool. Okay, stuff like that. So just remember that selection tool moves the whole thing. Direct selection tool lets you get in there and just move one aspect of it. Okay, moving on from there, there's a couple things in properties that are really worth knowing about. So you see we have, let's start it on comments, but I'm gonna look at both properties and layers. So properties are always based around, well, certainly we have the size, that's gonna be the same as I was just manipulating, but you can do numbers as well. But the appearance is always made up of a fill and a stroke. So even if you didn't notice here, by default, this is all filled white. That's why you can't see one object under the other. And it's stroke as just a thin black line. So with whatever I select, I'm gonna use my direct selection tool to be safe. I have colors and patterns that I can fill with, and I can go further, decide on my own colors, all of this to fill with. And then stroke has similar color choices, but also some stroke specific things like the thickness of the stroke. Well, that's really thick. And you can also change the opacity, so you can make these see-through. Now you start to see the other shape behind it. So, oops. Notice that the properties panel is always going to react to what you're selecting and give you different choices. Before I go further in that, I do want to mention layers because much like Photoshop, Illustrator divides things up into layers, but so far we haven't made a new layer. But look, you can open this up and you see all of these individual paths and objects mapped out on the single layer, and they are inherently one above the other. So you see that star is on top. So only when I started to make it transparent did we see the one below it. Okay, so I think appearance is pretty straightforward. I think layers is pretty straightforward. It does get pretty powerful. One thing that's cool is that if you select more than one object, you get a lot of interesting tools in what's called a Pathfinder. So I can combine objects, I can subtract one from the other, I can just work in the overlap, choices like that. So in other words, the combine one, I've got two things selected. Now that is my new shape, and it has all of the control that I would also have with the direct selection tool. You can see how pretty quick this becomes a powerful tool for things like logos and original graphics, stuff like that. I want to do just one more thing in this lesson, and it is a good jumping off point to the next lesson, which is actually about infographics and putting data into Illustrator. So I'm going to select up a few things, just clear some space here, move over, because I just want to introduce a text element. So if I get in here with a text element, I'm just going to do my name. Oops, caps lock. Let's do all caps. Why not? So first of all, that's really small. You have regular set of text controls with fonts and sizes, all of that good stuff. You can go larger, smaller. Illustrator is a good tool to lay out text with. You can customize. You can pick your fonts. let's see. You have regular things in terms of alignment and justification. You can lay out full paragraphs. I just want to give you a bigger, beefier font to give you my final example here. Like impact. Okay. So text works like other objects in Illustrator, and that's really very powerful. So you still have both fill and stroke. So I can get in here and use a swatch, and obviously you can learn to upload other patterns, and I can add actually a stroke to the outside. See that? So that is pretty powerful, pretty interesting stuff. But what's also neat is that I can use my direct selection tool. I can use my regular selection tool, and I can start to manipulate and do interesting things, right? I think I'm getting rid of that fill. It's distracting. There we go. So you can do all the things that you would expect in Illustrator, but the thing that's pretty neat is it has this choice with the text selected. You can go up under type and create outlines, And now we've turned this into regular shapes. And just like anything else, I can start to manipulate its actual shapes and turn these letters, that will get the path there, turn these letters into sort of original shapes or original art. So that's a pretty cool thing about Illustrator. And I think you'll see that that's the same flexibility it gives you with infographics, that when you work in some of those other programs, you couldn't really like take the slice out of the pie and pull it away. But in Illustrator, it'll let you do things like that. So anyway, take your time, have some fun with Illustrator, the basic tools, shapes, texts, colors, fills. It's worth spending 20, 25 minutes just to get your hands dirty, just to mess around and see what kind of interesting images you can make.